15 years ago, Mavis Leno's passion for activism was reignited. She was introduced to the Feminist Majority Foundation and their work with Afghan women and girls oppressed by the Taliban. She assumed the role as chair of the Campaign to Stop Gender Apartheid in Afghanistan in 1997, and she's been one of the most vocal critics of the Taliban's brutal treatment of women ever since. She is regarded as a leader in making the restoration of women's rights a non-negotiable part of a post-Taliban Afghanistan. Mavis is also known as being married to Tonight Show host Jay Leno, in a marriage that has worked for more than 30 years. If you're not moved to join Mavis in her cause, she'll no doubt inspire you to get behind something you're passionate about. Thank you very much for being here, Mavis.
Oh, it's my pleasure.
So you've said that both of your parents were social activists.
Oh, yeah.
What were their causes?
Well, in my childhood, the earliest part of my childhood, my earliest memories were about the McCarthy hearings. You know, and I didn't really understand what was going on, but I did see how upset my parents were, and I was raised to believe that Edward R. Murrow was the right hand of God, you know. And later on in my childhood and on into my teens, they would try and send money when they could and put what effort they could into the civil rights movement. The death penalty issue was also something that they were involved in. My dad was an actor, so he'd go and speak about anything.
Right, and he was a disc jockey at one point.
Yeah, he started out as a DJ, and in fact, he always wanted me to be an actress, which I would not be interested in at all.
Why do you say that?
Because I was the child of an actor, and I saw what a hard life it is, and how you have to spend your whole life basically going from place to place saying, do you like me? Do you like me now? How about now? It's a terrible way to live to me. You know?
Did that take a toll on your father, on your family?
We never had a lot of financial security, but we had a completely fantastic time. I learned a valuable lesson young, which is you don't need money to have fun. You know, not that money isn't fun, because that would be ridiculous, but you can have a great time without it. When I was really little, Eden Abez, the man that wrote Nature Boy,
yes,
used to come over to our house, and he wore long white robes and had hair down to his hips. And this is in the 50s, and our neighbors were like,
they were like early hippies.
White-knuckling it, yeah. So those were the kind of people that were around. So it was really a wonderful, and it definitely directed my choice as to who I would select to be the man in my life, because I remember thinking very young, I want to be with somebody who has wonderful stories and tells funny stories all the time.
Well, you found the right guy.
Yes, yes.
You've said that your mom was a very original woman.
I remember all her stories to me about the adventures she had before she married my dad. She was raised on a dairy farm in Oregon, in the middle of the Oregon woods, in a family of 9. And she decided early on she was never going to marry a farmer. And before she married anybody, she was going to travel. And so when she got out of high school, it was the Depression, and she and her sister that she was closest to, they would work waitressing or whatever, save up enough money to go. They started with Seattle, and then they went all over the country. My mother rode a tramp steamer to Alaska and worked in a bakery in Alaska.
She was very adventurous.
She was unbelievable. And all these stories she told me were all about what you could do if you had the nerve to do it. But, you know, and then she ends up marrying an actor. A completely different life than any of her brothers and sisters lived. All the rest of them stayed with the farm. So there was this example in front of me all the time.
Well, she sounds like a nonconformist.
She was just, you know, and she never thought about it in those terms. I remember one time, I was a very energetic kid, and where we lived in LA, there were tons of eucalyptus trees, you know how tall those are, and my best friend Tommy from across the street, he and I would climb trees, compete with each other, and we'd get way high up. After Tommy fell and broke his arm, She said, Mavis, if you ever find yourself falling, just relax and let go, and it won't hurt you. Now that is what a father would tell his son. That is not what mothers even now tell their kids.
Just
but
relax and let yourself go.
She did not tell me don't climb. She really taught me that there is no reason for me not to try new things and take chances.
So that's got to be where the roots of your feminism come from.
Absolutely. You know, my mother was always very angry about the fact that because she was a girl, she couldn't join the Navy, which would have been an easier way for her to see the world. And a couple of my uncles did join the Navy.
When you were young, when did you first sense this idea of being a feminist?
Well, pretty young, because when I was 7, I was horse crazy, and I was reading all the Black Stallion books and all of that stuff. So I'm thinking, how could I have a horse? How could I do something where I could make a living with horses? So I thought, okay, I'll be a jockey. And so I told my father when I grew up I was going to be a jockey, and he told me that women were not allowed to be jockeys, which I don't know if that was a law in California then or nationwide or whatever, but I could not believe my ears, because neither of my parents ever told me there was anything I couldn't do.
I've actually met and interviewed Julie Crone, who is the most successful female jockey in history, so there's been some progress made on that front.
I mean, the last 20 years of my life, and particularly the last 10, have been so wonderful to watch. Position by position, ability by ability, fall before the old shibboleths of sexism, and see women step in and do just as well as we always knew they would, if only they could, you know.
What made you join the Feminist Majority Foundation?
Well, it's difficult to be a feminist activist alone. And I had come to a point in my life, this is back in the late 90s. First of all, I believe in paying my debts. And I felt that one of the largest debts I owe are to the suffragists who came before me. And obviously I can't do anything but pay it forward, you know. And I did that passionately in the 70s, but I was kind of a foot soldier because I was just a kid. In the 90s, I was thinking, everything's going well in my life. I want to refocus my attention on this. And by a fortunate coincidence, I happened to sit down at a luncheon next to Peg Yorkin, who co-founded the Feminist Majority with Eleanor Smeal. It was an all-woman luncheon. And she asked me, you know, what brought me there. And I said, you know, and this is true, to this day I have no idea who invited me. And I said, the only thing that I can figure out is that somebody invited me because they know I'm a passionate feminist. The minute I said that, it was like, you know, hitting the jackpot. She immediately said, do you know about my organization? And that's how I came to join. And, you know, I love all these reality shows where women are just fighting all the time. We've never had a crossword in all the years that I've been in the Feminist Majority, you know, never.
So the Feminist Majority Foundation would be a terrible reality show if we followed the board members around?
It would be a great reality show, but in an entirely different way than the usual. We do all kinds of really crazy things. The idea that a relatively small feminist organization would take on an international issue like the situation of the women in Afghanistan, that's ridiculous. You know, even a very large feminist organization would have to think twice about that.
Your efforts on behalf of Afghan women and girls have made great strides. What was life like for Afghan women and girls before the Taliban?
In rural areas, it was still relatively conservative. They did wear the burqa, you know, that all-encompassing garment, which is now fairly famous. But that was like you're going to town clothes, you know. And in fact, it was a terrible problem for rural women, and most of the population of Afghanistan is rural, because only some women could afford to even own a burqa. And when the Taliban wouldn't let women leave their houses without them, women in these villages had to share them. And if it wasn't your turn and some emergency came up, you know, there was nothing you could do.
So under the Taliban, a woman was not allowed to leave her house without a burqa.
Yes. At the time that the Taliban came to power, because so many men had been killed first in the war with the Russians and then in the fighting amongst the Mujahideen, so many men had died that women occupied a huge amount of significant career situations in every major city in Afghanistan. Women surgeons, women teachers, women professors, elected officials, because basically in the absence of the men, they were holding their culture together and their families, because those wars made a lot of women widows.
And then all of a sudden, overnight
Comes the Taliban, and they literally came into the workplaces and told the woman doctor, the woman nurse, the woman professor, you have to put down your tools and leave now. Women no longer are allowed to work in Afghanistan in any capacity. You must put on the burqa and go home.
So this would have been late 90s.
Yeah, they took over in
96,
96, I believe, yeah. And they imposed, originally they said they were only imposing this temporarily until the chaotic situation that was prevailing before this was cleared up. And then rather than stick to that, they became stricter and stricter, because really the majority of the Taliban were very young guys. They were from the madrasas, or schools, religious schools. They learned their religion by rote and nothing else. They were not taught to read. The teachers would recite to them and they would recite back. They were not taught anything except that.
They were taught to think.
And that was it. So now you have all these young men who have no idea what the rest of the world thinks. So once they took over, rather than soften the edicts were not only about fundamentalist Taliban religious beliefs about how women should live. They were also about controlling more than 50% of the population.
Right.
Because if you're going to hold on to a country at the point of a gun, you have to start making sure that the majority of the people are under very strict observance all the time. And they effectively did that completely with the women. And then, since women could not leave the house unless they were accompanied by a close male relative,
right,
it tied up men as well. And men were also subject to a lot of control, but not the really almost science fictional control that the women were subjected to.
So at this point, the civil and human rights of women in Afghanistan, Afghan women and girls, are
completely gone.
Gone.
Many times when I first started advocating for them, people would react with doubt and disbelief, because some of the edicts are so awful and so ridiculous.
Give me an example.
Okay, you cannot wear shoes that make any noise when you walk in case you should distract a man's thoughts.
That was an actual...
That's an actual edict. If you got on a bus as a woman in Afghanistan, you would go and sit in the back of the bus. Rings a bell?
Yeah.
And that was because the windows on the back of the bus had curtains on them, so no man who was not a relative could accidentally see you in your burqa. When you handed the fee for the bus ride to the bus driver, you didn't hand it to him directly. You gave it to a boy who was under the age of 7, so that the driver's hands would not come in direct contact with a coin that was warm from a woman's hand.
So Mavis Leno, activist, begins to try to stir up the American public and the world media, and you have trouble doing that.
Well, here's what happened. At the very first meeting of Feminist Majority that I was at, Ellie Smeal told us all about what had happened to the women in Afghanistan under the Taliban, which no one was paying any attention to in the news. And as soon as I heard this, I found myself rocketing out of my seat saying, this is mine, I'll take care of this, I don't know how, but I'll make this visible. But then the nuts and bolts of it were the two things that you would normally do is get this stuff into the serious press and see if we can get grants so as to help us publicize it. And I haven't got the vaguest idea how to get a grant, and I didn't know anybody in serious media either.
You did know somebody in unserious media.
Well, this is what happens, and I always tell this to women because I think this is a problem that women have. I was miserable. I was furious with myself because I wanted to be a warrior for these women and I was getting nowhere. And I was angry about myself because I had never, learned these things before, even though there was no reason for me to. And suddenly one day it occurred to me, wait a minute, I don't know anything about how to get stuff in the Washington Post or the New York Times, but I know exactly how to make something famous in Hollywood. And then I went to Jay and I said, we are going to give $100,000 to start a foundation to end gender apartheid in Afghanistan, which seemed to be the best way of explaining how these women were being treated. And we'll hold one press conference in LA and one press conference in New York to announce it. And you'll get your publicist in New York to handle that one and your publicist in LA to handle this one. And so, of course, what do we get? Us, we get People, we get, every entertainment-oriented part of the media. And what an ocean of entertainment-based media there is now.
Yes.
So immediately this went from zero to everybody wanting to know about it. And then I start getting phone calls from the serious press after it's in People, after it's in Us.
What does it say about us that Us and People are leading the way on important news of the day?
This is something I really do feel very mad about. I feel that people underestimate the American public to a shameful degree. And I was told by these reporters that some of them at least had suggested that they do a story on this, only to be told by the higher-ups that the American people were not interested in human rights stories. They were really not interested in human rights stories about Islamic countries, and they were absolutely not interested in human rights stories about women. And there are so many American women who are single mothers, and it wasn't a big leap of imagination, I don't think, for them to think what would happen if, during the course of doing all this in their own lives, some teenage kid who can't even read and write shows up at their door with a gun and tells them they can't work anymore, they can't leave their house anymore, and the only way that they can bring money into the household, if a man isn't bringing it in, is if they have a child a male child, a boy, 7 years or younger, in which case he would be allowed to beg. And that's it. Or excuse me, 7 years or older, I should say.
So now there's some attention, there's a groundswell.
Oh yeah, there was a huge groundswell.
And there came a point when Unical was building a pipeline that would have funded the Taliban.
Yes.
As I read about it, I thought it was like your Erin Brockovich moment, where you went to the board meeting.
It isn't actually like that. Actually, our board, Feminist Majority is right on top of this stuff. When we heard this about Unical, we found out when they were having a board meeting. They said, oh, well, we'll throw up a big strike thing there, and our poor interns had to wear the burqas so people could see what it looked like, and we had